The mules are in the corral. Welcome to Mule Talk, and I'm Cindy K. Roberts, your host.
And my sidekick, our author, TV personality, and world-renowned mule trainer, Meredith Hodges of the Lucky 3 Ranch. All right, Meredith, we're back on. I want you to know before we get started, I always pack a cooler now when I come into the studio because I just don't know how long we're going to be here. I mean, that's just how that's how thorough our content is. So I'm ready to go.
That's so true, Cindy, and that's hilarious, by the way. And I just hope that we're covering enough things that we can let people know that there's a lot more to this training and developing our equine athletes than one might even think. And you and I have been at it long enough to know that we'll probably never run out of content. So pack your coolers, because when we start talking, we don't know when it's going to end, and it never really does. It just goes on to the next time.
There you go. We're talking about mule conformation today.
Yes, we are, in a general sense, and we're going to be talking about how important not only the conformation of our animals is, but the way we develop their bodies, and how important that really is to our equine athletes. Because everything that we ask them to do, if they're doing it wrong, there is a risk of developing arthritis as they age, and they're not doing the movements correctly. So if they're showing, a well-schooled judge is going to see it. So doing it the wrong way and just trying to do things in pieces, as we think our animals are capable of doing, and we think they're doing it the right way, but they're not, you need to consider the postural balance of the equine body. When you're training your equine, you can't train them in pieces. Oh, gee, I want him to side pass. So, looky, he's side passing now. He's doing this so good. Oh, I need a reining spin, so I'm going to do reining spin. Look at how fast he's turning. But he's swapping ends.
Right.
And these things always result, when you do these things the wrong way, they always result in soreness in your animal's body. And then we go, I don't know why he's so sore. Maybe the saddle doesn't fit. Maybe I'm not riding properly. Maybe this, maybe that. Well, it's probably an accumulation of all those things. And when you do it over time, anything that is repetitious like that is going to cause a problem. Think about people who play tennis and eventually get tennis elbow from using that arm exactly the same way over and over and over, but they're not using their whole bodies in that swing. So all that pressure goes right through the elbow, and eventually you get tennis elbow. If you're like my graphics artist, and Greta had a real problem with carpal tunnel until I told her that she had to be sitting up in good posture in front of her computer, and not only using her wrist and her hand to move that mouse around, but really relaxing her whole body all the way through, so that all of the muscles, tendons, ligaments, and everything in her body could participate in that movement, because her fingers were clenching up and they were getting stuck. And now that she's been practicing, using her whole body for that movement, her hand is still getting a little sore, because anything that's repeated movement like that is going to get a little sore. But it's not as bad as it was. And the other thing she did was she timed her phone to tell her when to stop working and get up and walk around.
Oh.
Because that is an important part of it for your whole body. When we're talking about our animals, we're talking about the same sorts of things. We ask them to do all kinds of things. And even what we think is so simple, like trail riding, is not so simple for our animals when they're not prepared properly, physically. We think about how hard these movements are going to be, how rough the trail is going to be, all the different things we're going to ask them to do, but we never give it much thought about preparing their body to do what we're asking them to do. And yet we watch football, we watch basketball, we watch baseball, and all these other sports where they actually prepare the athletes for the game before they go into the game. And they do those same exercises not only in training camp, but they do it before the games. They run through tires. They do push-ups. They do sit-ups. They do pull-ups. They do all these different things that use their entire body, and that gets their body aligned. So if in their game, what they usually use to catch the ball, to run the ball, to pass the ball, and all of these things, they make a misstep and they do it the wrong way, those muscles and ligaments and tendons are still strong in balance. So any injuries that are going to happen are going to be minimal, and they'll be able to work their way through it unless it's just a really severe accident. And that's the way we have to look at our animals, is that not while we're doing what we're doing, but what if it goes the wrong way? Is their whole body prepared? Their bodies are designed to carry weight below the spine. They're not even designed to carry weight above the spine. And that's why a lot of horses, mules, donkeys, ponies end up with a sway back after years of performance, because they're not prepared properly. They're not made to be strong in their core muscles, which are not just muscles, but their ligaments, tendons, soft tissue, cartilage, even in the joints, are not being developed evenly throughout the body. So that when they're performing what we're asking them to do, our athletes are at risk when we don't do that. When they're strong in the core, then they have a much more stable foundation to work from, and if anything goes wrong, it's going to be minimal. Even my animals have shown me, and the rock and roll story showed me how important this really is, because they are staying healthy. And rock and roll had ring bones, side bones, arthritis, calcification in the joints, in the spine, kissing spine, and all of these kinds of things from not moving correctly in harness. When I put them on my program, they got balanced in their core, and we took x-rays and everything at periods for so many weeks through the whole balance training and core strength training, and my veterinarian was finding out that they weren't developing any new problems, and they weren't exacerbating the old problems. Rock, actually, he's the one with the shattered hip. He actually got sound at the walk. Now, of course, there's more stress put on him at the faster gaits like trot and canter. So, of course, Rock couldn't trot without showing the damage to his hip. So he didn't get sound at the trot, but he got sound at the walk, where he could actually control it with the musculature and the balance that I had given him. And Roll had ring bone and side bones in 3 feet, and he was getting back good enough walking in the hourglass pattern that he graduated to obstacles, and then to the round pen for lunging, and then to ground driving. And in 2 years, I was able to get on and actually ride him at walk and trot. I knew it would come apart if I asked him to canter, because he was 18 years old. So I just didn't do anything that I knew would tear apart all of the training and development I had done with him. And I was able to ride him for 9 years. I've had discussions with the people over at Hearts and Horses, and they've been using horses for the therapeutic recovery of a lot of people with a lot of physical problems, a lot of mental problems. And as I told them, these horses, and they told me too, I gotta say, they told me they couldn't use just any horses over there. That these horses that they used had to be sound in mind and body. Then they could use them. But their focus was mostly on the horse's ability to just stay calm, take riders that were all over the place on their backs, and just be a kind and easy, tractable animal to use. So, when people think about therapeutic riding, a lot of times they think, oh, yeah, I've got an old horse that would do, because they think it's just a matter of putting these riders on these old horses and leading them around. It's a whole lot more than that. Hearts and Horses was absolutely right that these animals have to be tractable, because any kind of abrupt movement is going to unseat those fragile riders that they're putting on top. The other thing that I pointed out to Hearts and Horses was that if the animals are not moving in a balanced fashion, we talk about the movement of the animal being transferred to the rider on top and helping them to align their balance and ride better because they're establishing better balance. But if the animals aren't in balance, then they are going to transmit that same imbalance to the rider on top. So where you might think that you're putting these riders in balance and aligning their spine, you might not be doing that if the animal is not moving properly. And that's why they have adopted my program and training in developing the core strength in good postural balance, so that the animals are moving correctly and they're transmitting that kind of movement to their riders correctly, and the riders are having much more benefit from the animals as they're moving than they would if they were just getting on an animal where that was not part of the training program. It's really important to consider these things, and we are taught to consider the animal's conformation more than anything. When we're looking at them and everything, we think if they're well conformed, they're going to move properly. But I've told you before, we are not born with good posture. This has to be developed. And so we start out with our breeding programs, and we select mares and jacks with really good conformation. Mules and donkeys are going to be slightly different in their conformation than horses are, because most of what we know is based on the horse.
Sure.
And as we well know, donkeys have much steeper angles in their shoulders and their hips, and they move differently than horses do. A lot of people mistake the shuffle gait of the donkey as being gaited, and there are donkeys that are gaited, but most of them are just lazy in their way of moving because the training is lazy. They're not asked to put themselves in good posture. And the mules are, they got a little bit of the horse, so they have steeper angles in the hips and shoulders than the donkeys do. Still, mules and donkeys do have steeper angles in their shoulders, in their hips, and consequently in their pastern joints and their fetlock. And so they're going to be variable through there. But if that's not addressed in core strength training, then they are going to have a really difficult time with those steep angles, stepping well underneath from behind and reaching that center of gravity that comes right down through the middle of the torso. They will have a shuffle gait. And a lot of people mistake that for being gaited. But if they're truly gaited, they are going to have a single foot action, 1, 2, 3, 4 at the walk and at the trot. It's going to be very clearly a countable gait. It's kind of hard to tell at the walk, but when you put them into the trot, you should be able to count 1, 2, 3, 4. And the trot typically is a 2-beat gait, not a 4-beat gait. So that's how you can tell if they're truly gaited or not, is if they maintain that 4 beats at the trot. Then they are gaited. Again, in order for them to really move correctly, whether they're gaited or not, they need to have sufficient support through all those elements that support the skeletal frame. This is how conformation does have its part in how you're going to be able to train that animal and whether or not you're going to have difficulty getting them into a good postural frame, into their own ideal postural balance. Because if you've got an animal that's neck is too short, for instance, he's going to have a really hard time stretching across his back. And if his back is long, then you think, oh, well, the back's long, he can reach underneath with the hindquarters. But if he can't stretch that back all the way from the pole to his tail, and he's got a short hip on him, then he's not going to be able to reach that center of gravity there either. So when we're looking at these animals, conformationally speaking, there are things that you want to look at. And the ideal mule, for instance, should have a head that's slightly longer than that of the horse. This also helps his steeper angles because then he's proportionate. When you look at the animal, you want to make sure that he is proportionate and he doesn't look like he's pieces of different animals. And a mule will have a larger head than that of the horse. And his features should be prominent and give an overall pleasant appearance. They were culled from bad mares that weren't used for breeding years ago. And so they had a lot of the conformational defects that the horses were passing on. The ears should have sufficient length, be nicely shaped. The eyes should be large, soft, and kind, reflecting the mule's health and intelligence. They have incredible hearing. Mules can hear things from miles and miles away that we don't even hear.
You bet.
And you can tell that they hear these things because their ears will start moving. That is their way of talking to us. They can sense danger from a long ways away. And we don't think they necessarily can. And we call that disobedience, but it's really not if we paid attention to it. It's best to listen when a mule is doing something like that. And when they got big ears like that, you can't hardly ignore it. You know?
Right.
And it's the ears, too, that balance the larger, longer face. So when you're looking at the whole picture, a mule with a longer nose and everything, and a lot of times they're Roman noses too, and that's absolutely desirable in a mule. It makes them different from a horse. The Arabian mules will have Roman noses too, but they will have a more delicate, refined face overall. They won't get those big, bony, over-the-eyebrow kind of things on a refined Arabian type animal if you use a large standard jack. A lot of people think that you can get a mule that's taller from a mammoth jack, but that's not necessarily true. The jack contributes the thickness of the bone. So when you're looking at these animals and you want to see a nice picture, overall picture, then you need to think about the jack you're going to use to breed to any type of mare, so that you can balance these characteristics. They will look like one animal instead of an animal that is built of several different animals. Those are just so out of whack. Their eyes being nice and big. The forehead on a mule is broader than that on a horse, so they have a better range of peripheral vision than a horse does. They can see their feet. You hear that about them a lot of time. People also say that equines don't see color. Well, I'm not totally convinced of that.
Right.
They say red is a color they really don't like. I think it's more of a case that they don't like really loud, bright colors. Mm-hmm. Because my mules don't like bright red, orange, or yellow, and neither do I.
Right.
I find it quite offensive to my eyes. It's almost like you're looking into the sun. And I don't think that's a case of being colorblind. Shades of colors. Now, my mules like dull red shirts. They like burgundy shirts. They like more passive color in orange and yellow, too, which isn't quite as offensive to the eye. It's not like looking at the sun. Whenever I think about anything, I think about it in terms of what does it look like to me? What does it feel like to me when I'm judging their behaviors? I think adverse reactions are more of a case of taunting by a mishandler and by thoughtlessness from a handler. If you like wearing bright clothes and then you wonder why the animal is backing up and pulling on the halter rope, you might take another look at that. Because it very well could be your body language isn't great when you're getting on the end of the lead rope and they're backing up. You're not exactly being polite and considerate. So, think of the environmental things and the body language that's going on, and don't rely on the things that were determined in a laboratory. Now, I do know that from my jumping training, that they do have a problem seen directly in front of them. So when they're going to a jump, they may refuse a jump if they're not confident in their position and what that jump is like. And that's why before I do anything with my mules, donkeys, and horses and ponies, I will take them up to the jump and let them inspect it with their nose. Because I know when we're riding towards it at some clip, and it usually has to be approached at least a trot, they're not going to have the opportunity to see what the whole jump is. And in their vision, since they can't see directly in front of them, they're only going to see two sides of the jump on either side. And the mule is going to see more than the horse will. I had a horse, a Hanoverian, that was losing his sight. And he got more and more intensely anxious going to the jumps as we proceeded, and we finally had to stop thinking about jumping him. It was fine as long as the jumps were colored, because they were a different color than the environment. But when we had him jumping white jumps, he got to a point where he wouldn't jump them. And I looked at those jumps, and those jumps were blending into the background, especially on a cloudy day. You couldn't tell the jump from the clouds in the sky as he was approaching it and coming up. I could only kind of decide that it must have been because he could no longer see the sides of the jump, because he would refuse the white jumps and jump over the colored ones. So that made perfect sense to me. And no, I can't prove that's what he saw, but can any of us prove what these guys are really seeing?
Right.
I don't think we can, unless we're them. And we can make assumptions like I've been doing, and when I make adjustments with those assumptions, it seems to work really well. Now, the other thing is, we know that the forehead on a mule and donkey is going to be broader, and it tapers to a small and delicate muzzle with a shallow mouth and well-aligned teeth. This is good conformation stuff. And it makes for much better and cleaner communication connection between you and corners of their lips to your hands and back to the bit. This makes things much clearer in communication if their mouth is conformationally shallow. When you've got one that has a deeper mouth, that's going to allow the bit to slide back to the teeth. And that bit, it'll be more difficult for them to hold it in position over the bars of their mouth where there are no teeth. And if you're pulling on that bit and it's hitting the teeth, you're going to get bad behavior. You just will.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Sure.
Now, the other thing a lot of times we don't take into consideration is that the nostrils should be wide to allow for adequate respiration while working. Insufficient capacity for air exchange can cause anxious behaviors, just like it does in you when you feel like you can't breathe. If the body is not oxidized, it can cause weakness in the muscles, and the internal organs can't work properly. When you're looking at a mule and you're looking at him conformationally, make sure that he has the ability to expand his nostrils. He probably won't expand them when you buy him, but as you work with him, you're going to see that his nostrils, as you do this kind of training, you're going to promote better air exchange. And the nostrils will stretch and get better and give him more capacity for air intake. Both the mare and the jack are responsible for the shaping of all these characteristics I'm talking about. But the jack has the primary responsibility where the length of the ear and the massive thickness of the bone are concerned. So when you're thinking about breeding your mare to a jack, make sure that if your mare has tiny ears, now a lot of horses have bigger ears, and that's a good thing. When you want a mule or donkey offspring, you got to have big ears in the genet or big ears in the mare, so that you get a larger ear in the mule. The head of the jack can emerge in the resulting mule. So be sure to carefully consider the head of the jack to be used for breeding so he produces an attractive head in your mule. These kinds of decisions, we're just talking about the front end of the animal right now. And if you want a refined head, you're not going to be guaranteed an Arabian head on any of these guys, because jacks generally do have the Roman noses, but they could be very attractive.
Sure.
You want to select for more refined characteristics, a large standard jack, and always make sure the head is attractive. And even if you're going for a pack mule, then you would still want an attractive head on your mule. It just, people like attractive animals better, and they won't make as much fun of your animal if he has a certain degree of attractiveness. And when you're breeding, if you're going to breed for a pack mule, then you're really not going to want to use the jack for the height of the animal. It's going to be because of the thickness of the bone, because they'll be able to carry more weight. And in a pack mule, you also don't want too tall a mare or too tall a jack anyway. The jack does not contribute the height, the mare does. But you would want to breed to an animal that is 13 to 15 hands for a pack mule, because it makes it easier to load them. It's just common sense. But if that saddle mare is bred to a jack, a mammoth jack, then that mule is going to have the thickness of bone to carry a lot of weight. So that's what you kind of look for when you're looking for a pack mule. And again, you still want to have an animal that looks like it's all one animal and balanced across his whole body. Because if his back is too long in a pack mule, he's going to suffer soreness from having heavy packs over his back, just like he would if he was a riding animal and the back is too long and not balanced with the rest of his body. You want to make sure that that back isn't too long, and that some of that length goes right over the croup to the tail, so he's not slight behind and skinny behind. A lot of mammoth donkeys are like that. So when you're selecting a breeding jack, you want to make sure that he has as much angle in the hips and shoulders as he can have, and add to the length of the back from there and not from the middle of the animal where he's going to be bearing weight. Conversely, if you need the thicker bone on the shorter animal, as in the case of the pack mule, the mammoth jack is the better choice. So I've talked about, what you're going to want that way. And this way, too, if the animal is balanced, he's going to be able to use his hindquarters efficiently by stretching his back forward and stretching his hindquarters underneath to reach that center of gravity to support the weight that's on his back. So he will be able to carry more than the weight that can be carried by an animal that is not conformationally sound. And that's really important, whether you're carrying a rider or whether you're carrying a pack. They need this ability to be able to step underneath. One of the things I might say at this point is this is what I did not like about the horse training methods, and including this, you got to move their feet, so, disengage the hindquarters right away. Get them on the lead rope and disengage those hindquarters. I think just the opposite. I think that the animal, in order to carry a rider efficiently and to be able to do all of the athletic things that we're going to ask them to do, They need their hindquarters used efficiently. They just need to learn how to use them, right?
Right.
Right?
Absolutely.
They need to learn how to carry their bodies properly and to be in good posture. And again, that's why I use the postural aid, the elbow pull, because it gives them freedom of motion all the way around. It just doesn't let them raise their head so high that they hollow their back and their neck, and then consequently are not able to engage their hindquarters properly, and they will develop a sway back. And if they're going with a sway back, they're going to develop arthritis as they keep going.
Yeah.
It won't be just in their legs. It'll be in their back, too. These are just things that I've learned in doing all these things with my animals and seeing their reactions in training. The forearm, for instance, and the stifle of the mule should be well developed, thickly covered with smooth muscle that tapers to the knee and the hock in regular, well-defined lines. Again, these muscles should be thick and smooth, but not bulging. Horses have more bulk muscle in them. The mule has more long muscle. It's kind of like the difference between a weightlifter and a ballet dancer. And mules are known for their athletic ability. They're known for being agile, flexible, and being able to do anything at the split second. You know when you've got a mule evading what you want to do, that you can be sitting on him 1 minute, the next minute he's gone, So,
Yeah.
they're quite capable in many different ways. And one of the little stories I could tell you about that very thing was when I was practicing gymnastics with my 14 three-hand Arabian mule, Lucky 3 Firestorm. Again, her name is so appropriate. She taught me a lot. But we had a line of 5 jumps in a row, first cross rail going to vertical to an oxer, which is 2 jumps. It's a wider jump. Your vertical is just a straight jump up and down. Cross rails are just like it sounds, cross rails. And then on the other side of the oxer was another vertical and another cross rail. Well, this was before I bothered to show them the jumps that we were going over. She's the one that taught me to make that a practice. We started this gymnastics, and the jumps were low. The cross rails were at probably 8 inches at the middle. The vertical was at 12 inches. The oxer was at 18 inches. And so I thought, this is easy. Everything's low. So we're just going to trot to this, and we're going to go over all 5 jumps. Well, I was mistaken.
Whoa.
We went over the cross rail. We went over the vertical. And when she saw the oxer, which was only 18 inches tall, she ducked to the left, and I went over the oxer.
Whoa.
Yeah, that quick.
Woo.
I mean, those things were only 1 stride apart. I thought, what's she going to do? Well, she's going to dodge it. That's what she's going to do.
Yeah.
She taught me that she needed to see what we were doing first. So I went ahead and I led her through all the jumps, and I went back and forth and zigzagged through them and showed her every square inch of every jump we were going to jump. And then I did one more thing. On the first cross rail jump that I had, I thought, well, if I steer her towards the middle of the jumps right from the get-go, maybe she'll go through all of them. So I took 2 rails and I put them right next to the standards and just had them coming off the side and to the ground, so it kind of made a track for her to follow over that first jump. And after I did that, it was like bounce, bounce, bounce all the way through. No problem. I know what we're doing now. So, that's the way you learn. You make mistakes, and they tell you about it. and then you learn.
There you go.
But it's really, really important for building their muscles correctly that you do think about these things. That's why I use the elbow pull when we're schooling, even on the lead line. In the hourglass pattern, it's important that they're carrying themselves properly to build up that core muscle properly so we don't have problems later. Now, we were just talking about the stifle and the forearm, and if those things are not formed properly or exercised properly, then they're not going to be strong. And those are joints, and they need the strength on either side of them and around them in order to operate properly. And there's a lot of mules out there and donkeys and horses that are getting locked up in the stifle. And when people say they have problems with that, I had firsthand experience with that with my dressage mule after his reining training. He got locked up in the stifle, and that was the reason that I started him in dressage, because I thought that we had the chiropractor unlock the stifle, and then I knew massage alone was not going to do it, so I got an equine chiropractor to get him aligned. Then we did massage, and then I went to the leading exercises because I didn't figure that most people start dressage under saddle, but in his case, he was injured in the stifle. So I thought, well, I'm going to try this core training that I have developed and see if this won't work with him to strengthen that stifle joint and allow him to proceed in riding and being more balanced animal, and see if that locking up in the stifle will go away. And as he moved through the different levels of dressage, it surely did, because dressage is done in tiny little steps under saddle. But I first took him on the lead line, then lunged him in the elbow pull, then went ahead and when I was doing the elbow pull in the round pen, by the way, I started out using side reins, and I saw how tense that made him through his whole body.
Yeah.
So I decided not to use those and to use the elbow pull instead. And so I did that, and then I got on and rode him through the hourglass pattern after ground driving and everything in the elbow pull. And that made a world of difference in the way that he was moving. Now he was floating. His lessons with my dressage instructor were getting better, much better. Now, when he ran off with me, he was running in balance. And when he stopped four square.
All right.
So I knew I was making progress. And at this point, I might say that it's important, too. We know that the donkeys and the mules have long muscle and everything. But the one thing that you will see bolt muscle on is a donkey in the length of their neck. So when you're looking at the neck of your animal, when you're breeding your animal, when you're looking at an animal you want to buy, you want to make sure that his neck has good length and comes well back over the shoulders and into the withers. Because, again, he's going to have a really hard time stretching his spine if he doesn't have the length of neck to be able to do that. If he has a shorter neck, he's only going to arc his neck. And that was the problem I had with the side reins, too, because they just made him arc his neck, but they didn't really get him to stretch over his spine. It actually made him kind of arch his neck, but then when he was turned out, his neck got a U-neck on it. The withers need to be as apparent as they can be on a mule or donkey, and a lot of times they're very shallow. If you do this core strength equine postural training, it will help the withers to start coming up and be shown over the top. And the spine will blend into the torso more, which also adds to the prominency of the withers. And so your tack and equipment, particularly your saddle, is going to have a better chance of fitting if you do this kind of exercise coupled with correct conformation. I mean, your animal has to have correct conformation, and there are certain things you can do to enhance an animal that doesn't have the best conformation. If they don't have the best conformation, then I wouldn't suggest buying them. I wouldn't suggest breeding them.
Right.
You want to get the best out of your mules, and you want to make the best showing no matter where you're going with them and what you're doing. And in order to get your athlete so he looks like an athlete and looks attractive to the unschooled eye, which most people have, these are the things you will need to take into consideration. And short necks are really, really prevalent in the mule and donkey industry, not so much with horses. If you have a jack that has a short neck and is out of balance, he's not the jack to use for breeding. He really, really isn't. If he's got steep shoulders and steep hips, he's going to pass that on. And people are under the false impression that you can take a jack, and if he's got some conformational defects, and the mare is super cool and super great looking, and her conformation is perfect, that the mule will fall somewhere in between. Well, that's not necessarily true.
Right.
The offspring is going to pick up any faults that either one of them has. So it's best just don't use those animals for breeding. There are so many animals, people think they're going to make some money or they don't have to pay as much for a mule if they breed it. But then they find it can't do what they want it to do, and they don't realize that it's because they're limited in their conformation. Their athletic ability is limited by their conformation, so they might become displeased with the animal and pass it on to a new owner who also becomes displeased. And the end of that trail is the slaughterhouse.
Yeah.
And it's really, really sad to see all these animals that end up there. And then there's so many people breeding, they think they're going to get into it and breed and sell these animals and everything, and they may make money, but these animals get handed off, and then they end up in the kill pens. And then somebody feels sorry for them, and they end up getting them and saving them from the kill pens and take them home, and then they find out that they're very hard to handle because now you've got an animal that was not comfortable in his body because he wasn't trained in good posture with correct development of his body and mind, and so he's going to be difficult to handle because he doesn't know how to move, and then the new person doesn't know how to do the postural core strength training to help make him better.
Right.
Some people would. Because some people listen to our podcasts, and some people
there you
know
go.
that there's value in doing that, and they learn, And that's really important, and that's why I say, you in life, you are on an ever-learning track if you leave yourself open to it. There's no hard and fast in this, and there's not going to be any end to the things that we can talk about that will improve these situations with your animal and with the people. People are going to benefit from all of this, too, because you can't help but be in good posture when you're leading that animal around that hourglass pattern and doing the squaring up and leading from the correct side and holding the lead rope in the left hand, pointing in the direction of travel with your right hand, and actually staying in sync with the animal's front legs, looking where you're going. Now put your body in good posture too, so you won't be a humped over old person later on, like my grandmother said. She told me, if you don't want to be a sorry old woman, then you will walk in good posture and use good manners. And nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, it really works.
Yes, it does.
So you're doing yourself a favor that way too. Might mention at this point too, it is hard to keep a saddle on an animal without withers. But like I said, when you're doing these exercises, and if you've picked an animal that maybe doesn't have the best withers, but has really good conformation, you can enhance that by getting your saddle placed in the middle of the torso so that you're sitting over the center of gravity. The exercises will allow the animal to learn to reach with his hindquarters to get underneath his body, which will cause the front end to be elevated and lighter and easier to move. He'll be lighter in the bridle. And so you're really enhancing everything. But be careful about getting caught up with breeching. Because when you're riding the animal, they need complete and full range of motion. And breeching has so many straps on it that if you get the breeching adjusted so it'll hold the saddle in place, then chances are the animal is not going to have full range of motion and his movement will be stilted. Now, he can move any way he wants with a pack on his back. Any way that he has to compromise for that weight on his back is acceptable, and particularly on the trail, because that pack will move the way he wants it to. When he moves his back, for instance, or a hip or a shoulder, he can readjust the position of that pack that's on his back. But when you're up there and he shifts those things, you don't necessarily go where he wants to put you because you perceive it as going off balance and you're going to fall off. So you get resistance. So now he's meeting with resistance. And that's why I say that I think it's better if you ride with a crupper. And if it's adjusted properly, it's not going to break their tail. It's just going to hold the saddle in place.
Right.
And if you're riding correctly, you're going to actually help your animal with that. Mm-hmm. You don't want your animal to be required to just pack you around.
Right.
Learn to ride while you're up there. Right?
Very good.
That is the correct answer.
Yeah. So if you've got the balance of the animal being confined to the elbow pull, it's in his hands to control his own good posture. And if he can't get his head up in the air and invert his neck and back, he's going to be less likely to run off with you because he can't really run very fast unless he grabs that bit and raises his head to where he's inverted his neck, and now the bit is riding free in his mouth and you have no control whatsoever. But when he's confined by the elbow pull, he feels like you've got more control than you really do. And he can still run full out if he needs to. But it won't be in a resistant fashion. So you want, for the same reasons, the back of a mule or donkey is generally shorter than that of the horse. The back of a mule or donkey is usually straighter across than that of a horse. But beware of a rigid straight across back.
Right.
Because that is something that may or may not be able to change with this postural correction. You don't want a long back mare and a rigid back donkey because you might not get the contour across the back that's needed to carry you and the saddle efficiently and still go ahead and move correctly. And like I was saying, they need to be able to stretch their back to avoid getting kissing spine. The animals in their back do not have locking vertebrae the way we do. They have it, but there are things called spinous processes that come out of it and stick straight up. And that's why the withers are higher than the rest of the back, and those spinous processes get shorter as they go under the saddle. But if the animal is allowed to raise his head and invert his neck and his back, those spinous processes get close together and start rubbing and creating calcification between them. And I asked my veterinarian about the only way to really fix it, and he said surgically. He said they get in there and they dissolve the calcium deposits that are between the spinous processes. But it's a surgery. And that doesn't mean they're even going to heal correctly in good posture either.
Yeah.
And I said, so what do you recommend? And he said, you know what? Your elbow pull is the best way I know to therapeutically pull those spinous processes apart with the stretching that they will do from head to tail. It's really, really important. So the jack and the mare both need a neutral length of body between the hips and the shoulders. And that will allow for the contour, the dip in their back to exist. So mules that have a rigid back can be rehabilitated through this process of getting to good posture by doing the elbow pull, by using the elbow pull, and by being led through the hourglass pattern. Then they can get that kind of contour there, but it's not too deep. And the core strength that is on either side of the bones in the spine will be stronger. And you can tell when they're stronger by looking at them when you see that the spine is not clearly defined above the torso, but looks like the spine blends into the torso. On a mule, the ribs of the mule should be well sprung, not slab-sided, and separated around the torso, so they have good distance between them. They should not be flat and narrow. They should range from right behind the withers to close to the hip bone, so they encase the entire torso, and then move into the flank. And the flank should be well set down from the croup, just above the stifle, with a nearly flat appearance and not as indented as that of a horse. The hip, stifle, and gaskin should all have smooth muscled look, not bulging, as is seen in many horses. The more bulky muscled mare is generally crossed with the smooth muscled jack to create a more bulky yet smooth musculature of the mule than that of the jack. As I said earlier, lock-step cease to be an issue when the equine is taught to move in good postural balance through the core. And consequently, the chest of the mule should be deep and prominent, broad, and well-developed. It should resemble a turkey's breast with little or no line of separation as seen in a horse's chest.
Yeah.
Since jacks are narrower through the chest than our mares, the mare chosen for breeding should exhibit much width and depth through the chest to complement the narrow chest of the jack, because you don't want a narrow-chested mule either. They can't move either. They need that width in the chest to be able to move their legs properly, for the joints in the forearm and in the hip, in the stifle, to move properly as well. The legs of the mule should be nearly straight, broad, clean, with adequate bone density for the size of the mule. The legs should be well braced at all four quarters and properly balanced underneath the mule's body. When the mule or donkey is properly conditioned, he should move with equal weight over all 4 feet and use his body properly on turns by bending through the arc of any turns and any lines through his torso, so that he does not lean like a motorcycle. Because that will sling the weight to the inside. When you sling the weight to the inside or on one side or the other, that's what's called compromising. And if he compromises that weight swing, he's going to put more pressure on the legs on the inside than he will on the outside, which will compromise the knees and hock and fetlock joints and pasterns. So then they start getting things like bowed tendons, wind puffs, and things like that. Those are all developed from imbalance in the legs.
Right.
The knee should be broad, deep, firmly set, and the hock should be broad and muscular, being slightly cow-hocked in the hindquarters with the toes pointed slightly out is common in mules, and it's actually preferred for performance, though not showing at halter. A squared-off mule will have a hard time. Now, if he's really straight-legged and squared behind and doesn't show a little bit of cow-hock, it's going to be hard for him to get his weight over that pivot foot. It's almost like being post-legged. But post-legged means that they're straight through the hocks. They can be straight-legged behind when you're looking at them behind and not be cowhocked and not be post-legged either. But being slightly cowhocked will enable them to more easily place that pivot foot. His gaits, if he's in good equine posture and he has good conformation, he will be able to move with regular rhythm and cadence, and he should never appear lazy. It's my experience when you take the time to develop this postural core strength in your animal that supports the skeleton, that they feel good because they're healthier. All of the joints are lined up properly and are moving properly according to the laws of physics. There is not going to be compromised pressure on either side of those bones. All of the elements that support the skeleton are going to be symmetrically strengthened and will hold that animal in a great posture, a good equine posture while he's moving, so that there won't be but minimal compromises created by slight and very short losses of balance as they move through training and as they gain their strength. It's really important to do this, because you can get to the end of this training, and this postural core strength training takes 2 years at the max, and it only takes doing the hourglass pattern on the lead rope 3 to 6 months, depending on how well they do. And you can tell if they're ready to move on to the next step, which would be adding obstacles and then breaking those down into little steps and furthering that strength at the deepest level. And then once you've got that base done, that will be 6 months to a year for those 2 sections. And then when you get to the round pen and lunging, you're going to do 3 to 6 months in lunging and 3 to 6 months in ground driving, first in the round pen and then out in the open in the hourglass pattern. So you've got a year or 2 of this groundwork to do. But the beauty of this kind of groundwork is it adds longevity. So if you put the time in to do this, you're putting in a maximum of 2 years, minimum of 1 year before you are able to ride them. You're going to gain 10 years of longevity and use life in your animal on the other side.
Yeah.
The other thing, this is what's really important too, and I had a person that they were talking about starting animals under saddle at 3 years old. And my experience with this is that, yes, you can start your animals and do, I used to think, you could drive them at 2 and show them and driving at 2 because it wasn't as stressful. But then I found out that their knees weren't necessarily fused at 2.
Right.
And it was a real crapshoot if they were even fused at 3. And then I looked at it from the behavior of the animals. And it seemed that these younger animals were so easy to train. They wanted to do everything just the right way for me when they were young like that. And they did it, and they showed, and I showed them up to about 5.5. And when they turned 6, they were little hellions. And the only... They didn't like anything we were doing. That's when all these adverse resistance behaviors surfaced. No longer were they the nice little kid that wanted to prove how cool they were and win my affection and all of this. They were rebellious teenagers at 6, and that didn't get straightened out till they were 7.
Right.
And that made me think about what was really going on here. Something had to be going on. And since I stopped riding them at 3 and stopped asking so much and went into this program of developing their bodies with core strength and everything and making them comfortable with everything that they were doing, we just breezed past 6 years old, no problem. Mares, mules that were in heat, no problem. Donkeys that didn't want to go anywhere now had the strength to move and were no longer lazy. None of my animals were lazy. Not ever. When I just moved those steps to a later time and stop thinking just because they did it doesn't mean they're capable of doing it comfortably. They were compromising all that time because they wanted to please me. And I recognized that, but they were hurting themselves while they were doing it, and they didn't realize that till they got to be bigger animals. And then I piled on all the stuff, and I thought everything was fine, but they had sore spots in their bodies from compromising all those years.
Wow.
And that was the illumination that I came to. And like I said, no longer was any of that a problem. It hasn't been a problem. My mules are now between the ages of 33 and 35 years old, and they're all useful, and they're all out there playing and kicking and bucking and traveling in good posture. They track up. They still track up. Not a one of them is lazy. And they get out there and they play. And no, I don't ride as much anymore. But if I do ride, we trail ride around the ranch. I don't go up in the mountains anymore because I'm afraid of all the fools that are up there with guns. But, and I want to live long.
Right, there you go.
So do my mules. So we do most of our riding here now. But still, they are full of energy, ready to go. And even the ones that started out being a little lazy aren't lazy anymore. And they just like doing everything we're doing. I can only attribute that to this program and the consideration and the respect I've had for the animals, and changing my focus from can they do things to are they comfortable in their bodies, and are their bodies in good posture, strong in good posture? Are they holding their foundation? Are they comfortable in it? And most of all, are they happy? And I can tell if they're happy because their eyes are always bright. And when I walk out there, every single one of them perks their ears and come running up to me looking like, come on, where are we going? I want to go. I want to go.
Yeah.
And boy, am I in trouble when I only want to take one. They're all ready to go, and they're very polite, so they don't bum rush the gate or anything like that. They've all been taught their boundaries, and they're just a little disappointed when they can't go with me.
Sure.
But I take the one to the tack barn, and I'll saddle them up, and then I got to go ride through the dirt pen where the rest of them are, and it's about probably an eighth of a mile along the fence of the dirt pen out to the riding, out in the hay fields and stuff, and I'll go along there and I'll have every single one of them following me along the fence.
Yeah.
It's pretty clear they want to go, you know. But while we're talking about that, we've gotten down to the legs and how the legs need to be and everything. But the main thing is their feet. It's really important, as I've said in other podcasts, that they are fed properly to keep those hooves healthy and hard and balanced. And the old saying, no foot, no mule, is literally true, as it is in any nomadic animal. If the hooves are not trimmed and balanced properly, it will offset the balanced entire body and can compromise longevity in the animal because his entire internal structure will be compromised. This is why it's really important to find yourself a really good farrier that knows the difference between mules, donkeys, and horses and can trim them appropriately. Because if they aren't, like I said, that whole body is going to be off, and they're going to develop compromises in their bodies that affect not only their movement but the function of their internal organs. The hooves of the mule will be smaller and more upright than that of a horse of equal size. They should be well sprung and supported, not contracted. They should have a smooth appearance and look sleek and oily. And the donkey's hooves will be even more upright with more heel on them than the mule's will be. No ribbing should be apparent, and the frog should be well extended, healthy, and make adequate contact with the ground for good circulation in the hooves. When the mule is being trimmed, he should be left with more heel than that of the horse. The shape and condition of the hooves of the jack and the mare are both equally important when considering the foot development in the mule. You need to have a farrier, too, that has gone to farrier school. I have heard so many people say, oh, trimming the hooves is just like trimming fingernails. Well, no, it's not. And so you need somebody that really knows what they're doing. And a lot of farriers that have gone to school just don't like to do mules. Personalities are different, and you're just going to have to find somebody with a personality that includes intense patience, an open mind, and someone that will be willing to do whatever's necessary to take the time to adjust to your mule, to build a relationship with your mule. And then you'll be sitting pretty. Then they'll be balanced. The old people on the tours asked me that. You know, they said, well, all this posture stuff really makes a lot of sense. Can we use this? I said, yeah, actually you can. They said, well, it's hard to remember everything they tell us to do. You know, you got to point your toes in the direction of travel, bend your knees, tuck your butt, suck in your stomach, roll back your shoulders, pick up your chin, look where you're going. And I told them, I says, no, really, it's just like walking in the hourglass pattern. There's only two things you need to remember. And that is point your toes in the direction of travel and look where you're going.
Yeah.
And if you do that and keep equal weight over both of your feet, you will be in good posture. And it doesn't take that much to remember it. Now, getting on to the coat and the hair of the mule should be soft and shiny, covering pliable skin with about probably 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch of fat over the top, so that you don't really see the ribs, although on some thoroughbred types you will see a hint of the ribs over the body. But if they have adequate fat over the ribs, then it's probably fine. Donkeys have typically a thick coat of hair, and if you pair him with a mare that it has more of a thinner coat of hair, then you won't have a mule that gets really shaggy in the wintertime. It'll be a little bit more manageable coat. People talk about how tough mules are, but that doesn't mean they have tough skin.
Right.
It means they're tough in their tenacity and their constitution, but they're extremely sensitive to the skin. And they can feel a fly on his landing anywhere on their body right away. They don't take kindly to inhumane techniques. If they're hurt, they will resist. And I used to recommend using spurs to get them to react, but that was when I was training younger animals and not waiting until they were 5 to get on. I found, and even then I recommended blunt spurs because they do react to spurs with rowels and stuff, and they do have parts of their body where the thin skin is, and especially right behind the forearms like that. And you can do some real damage to them there. And if you hurt them, they're not likely to take kindly to any kind of training. You've got to consider that. And you consider the pliability of the skin when you're using grooming tools, too. Because if it's thin going over a bone and you use a metal grooming tool, they're not going to like that very much either. And you can go to our podcast about grooming and find out better ways to do that. And in short, the best grooming tool I've ever used that takes care of shedding and everything is just a human hairbrush. It's got all those different bristles on it, got little round plastic balls on the ends of the tines on it, and it scratches them and it gets all the way to the bottom of the hair, and it's particularly good on donkeys who have longer hair. They shed out fast, and I've been grooming mine about not even every week, every other week during shedding season, and the hair just comes out really easy when you do it regularly like that, and they don't get that scruffy look. If you use a shedding blade, it's going to give them split ends, and then the coat gets dull. A lot of grooming tools are really hard on their coats like that. You really do want to just do it regularly and do it with a friggin' hairbrush, you know. and then in fly season and everything, if you keep your barn clean by cleaning it up every day, you're not going to have as much work. If you use Farnham Tri-Type 14 fly spray, you won't have to put anything on their legs and flatten the hair down. The hair is supposed to be standing on end. And if they feel a fly land on that hair, then They can twitch it off, or they can turn around and bite it off, or they can slap it off with their tail, or if you keep manes like I do, then they can shake their head and get it off that way. And so you really don't need things that will flatten the coat, because if the coat's working right, the flies won't be on there long enough to lay eggs. The places where they go and where they're standing around in a stall and run are clean, then they're not going to be as infestated by as many insects that will bite them or lay eggs. And if you monitor your turnout time to a maximum of 5 hours a day and keep them in a dirt pen the rest of the time, then the time that those insects have on their body is really limited, and again, you won't get all those sores. And if they do bite themselves and they need have a sore that needs tending, then you can just use Neosporin on it, and it will go away overnight.
Right.
So I might talk about equine movement now with a very touchy subject. When we did the documentary Walk On, we interviewed a guy out at Pomona University who did research on equine movement. There was something I just didn't like about the whole section. I was watching the horse that they were using. He was on a treadmill, and he had sensors on his body, and they were taking the data from the sensors on the horse's body. But the one thing that horse never did on that treadmill was bring his hindquarters up under the center of gravity, right down straight through the middle of the torso. He was just a little bit shy of it. And although he looked like he was stepping up from behind, he was stepping up from behind, sort of, but not really, not what I've seen in my animals. I started thinking about treadmills, and the more I thought about it, the madder I got, because I thought about, well, what does the treadmill do when you stand on it? You stand still and you don't start walking. Well, what happens if you start walking even? You take a step and the thing keeps sending you backwards.
Yeah.
So you can never really walk in good posture on a treadmill. And I thought, well, if it's that way for me, it must be that way for the horse. And it must be why that horse is not really stepping under his center of gravity. Well, okay. Well, I'm going to take a chance here, and I'm going to say that all the data they got from a horse moving on a treadmill has got to be bogus. It can't be right. It can't even be as right as a horse that's moving freely over the ground.
Right.
And then I got to thinking, well, if you want to go one step further with this, Meredith, there are treadmills in every gym in every part of the country where people go to exercise, along with a lot of other artificial exercise equipment.
Yeah.
And I remember when I grew up, they had exercise programs in the schools where we were doing walking, jogging, racing, sit-ups, pull-ups, push-ups, and all of these things without the aid of all these artificial things. Our society was a much thinner society than it is now.
Right.
So I go, well, this just can't be that beneficial when you're talking from a standpoint of common sense. Then came the light bulb moment. Well, people are in it to make money in this society, and they make a lot of money in those gyms with that kind of equipment.
Yeah.
And the doctors make money out of knee and hip surgeries. And I thought, well, this just can't be good. And as I said in our previous interview, I researched this even further and realized through the use of therapeutic riding and my association with our award-winning Hearts and Horses therapeutic riding program, we have set the bar a lot higher, and these programs are being a lot more efficient with people. They have conceded that riding a horse is the number 2 way to exercise in a healthy manner, and the only one that they consider more helpful for people is walking. And walking is where you're walking with attention spent to good posture. It's not even jogging that's better. A lot of people go out and they jog and they think they're doing themselves favors. But if they're not paying attention to their good posture, then they're not really doing it the right way.
Right.
And if you're not doing it the right way, you're going to compromise your body. And this is the same way for our equines. They really need us to pay attention to their bodies first and foremost during the training process. It's developing their core strength so that they can carry their riders efficiently and not hurt themselves. You need to be really discriminating when you're assessing the disposition of the jock, because that's going to tell you how he feels in his body, too, and the disposition of the mare, because a lot of these dispositions are influenced by poor conformation in the animal. And when it comes to the jock, too, you have to kind of think about where any aggression is coming from as far as disposition is concerned, because a lot of times it could be hormonal. So if you're looking at a donkey jack to use for your mares, and he's pastured next to the mares that is cycling, that's not going to tell you much about his disposition. He needs to be in a place where the mares or the genets are off by themselves somewhere else. Then you can make an adequate assessment about what his disposition is when you want to choose him. And the same thing for the mules, because if the mules are next to the mares and you're looking for a mule to buy, and you're looking at his conformation and everything looks really good, and now you're going to determine his disposition. If he's next to the mares, he's going to want to be next to the mares, and he may take exception to you trying to take him away from the mares in some fashion. So he's not going to look like a really affectionate kind of guy if he's near mares. He's just not going to.
Right.
So when you're looking at these mules, you need to go ahead and look at them by themselves. And if they come up to you and they go, "Hey, who are you?" You know,
Right.
you see what I'm saying? Then they're willing to take you on as a client. You know,
That's a good sign.
yeah, that's always a good sign. And so these are the kinds of things that you need to kind of look for and take a common sense approach to when you're doing it, and try to think of all the different things that could affect behavior beyond conformation. What I have mentioned here today is that you need to look and make sure that animal looks like he is one animal conformed with the ideal traits that an equine of his stature should have. His attitude is often influenced by training practices and environmental experience, so take that in mind too. Keeping all these considerations and guidelines in mind when breeding or buying can definitely increase your chances of producing or owning an attractive, usable, and enjoyable equine companion. My website is at www.lucky3ranch.com, and I have a second one for children at jasperthemule.com. We also have a Facebook page, Meredith Hodges Public Figure page. I do have a personal page, but it's maxed out. But I also put the same thing on both pages. And if you don't find what you want posted on Facebook or on my website, you are welcome to email me at meredith@lucky3ranch.com, and I answer all my mail promptly. And you can also call me at 1-800-816-7566. If you don't get me straight up, leave a message. I answer all my calls too.
Awesome. Wow. Well, you have a wonderful afternoon, and we will talk soon.
Gotta go. My mule is looking for me.
Mule Talk is an Every Cowgirl's Dream production.